along with Paul Zimmerman of Sports Illustrated, Paul McGuire and Sam Rosen of ESPN. And, of course, we'll be going back to the West Coast. We'll be getting the latest from Greg Wyatt and Howard Balzer on what's happening west of the Mississippi. And, of course, we'll be heading back towards ESPN's headquarters with Bob Lee, Mel Kiper, and Chris Berman as we continue our 6th year of coverage of the National Football League Collegiate Player Draft. If you're just joining us, round 1 is completed. We have started round 2 already with Buffalo taking Mark Trainowitz, the tackle or guard from the University of Nebraska. And when you talk of Trainowitz in Nebraska, you know, go back to Remington and the fine offensive line athletes that they've come through. And, in fact, Trainowitz follows in that very same mold.
Completely different type ball player.
Right.
Remington,
great ball player.
Yeah. Remington, big, sort of a mauler, down in the dirt. Trainowitz pops off the ball quicker than any center I've ever seen in my life. I think he's a great, great player.
Look very closely. Here is Trainowitz just driving time and time again. This was the scene as coaches looked at films after they played Nebraska. Here's a young man who played tackle, played center. He very well could be projected as a guard in the pros. As you say, you're hopeful that they'll keep him there.
Maybe I'm crazy, but he's the best blocking center I've ever seen in college.
George, you got to remember something. A few years ago, the Buffalo Bills drafted Jim Richard, which was a pure center. And he is now going to be one of their starting guards. And with the speed of Trainowitz, yeah, he'll be a center, but with that speed and depending on what Will Grant does, or if they have someone else to go into that spot, he still may end up being a guard.
Or a tackle.
Or a tackle.
All right, we're waiting on the selection by Minnesota as Buffalo has taken Mark Trainowitz, the offensive lineman from Nebraska. I want to remind you that Green Bay, Tampa Bay, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, the Raiders of Miami don't have selections in the second round, but a whole lot more folks do. We'll be back.
Minnesota is next up with about 7 minutes to pick in their selection. Mark Trainowitz has been the first selection so far in Buffalo. Houston has gone for defensive help, as we well expected they would in this draft, and they wanted Ray Childress. They got Ray Childress, and they also went for Richard Johnson. In just a second, we'll get back to Houston, but right now the selection, the second selection in round 2 from Minnesota. Don Weiss approaching the podium and checking to see exactly what the particulars are. Don, the executive director of the National Football League. Pete Rozelle, I guess, has handed over the baton here for round 2, and we'll see who will run the anchor leg on the 3rd round today of our coverage. Our coverage going right through to 4 Eastern time. Any guesses
what time
quickly,
is that
Mel?
on the wire?
11, actually. Mel?
Okay.
Any thoughts?
Any
quickly?
thoughts? I'll tell you, there's some good linebackers still there. I'm just going to wait and see what he says.
Minnesota's selection on the 2nd round is Isaac Holt, defensive back from Alcorn State. Houston is up.
So now the Oilers are up. The reason we were discussing the Oilers, they have gone for defense already with Childress and with Richard Johnson, the Wisconsin defensive back, and we had 3 rather early selections of the Wisconsin backs. Hugh Campbell, the head coach of the Oilers, we asked him recently, can you get a starter out of the draft that they can help you immediately?
I think, and my opinion's changed on this in the last few years, but in the last few years since coming down to the States, I think that there are some positions you can count on early instant help, like at the wide receiver position. I think that Lewis Lips is an example of that up at Pittsburgh. I think you can get somebody come in and play running back relatively soon. I think that a position like offensive line takes some time, and we have a young line that we think is going to be one of the fine lines in the league.
Oilers approaching this draft certainly knowing they needed defensive help. They have drafted twice so far in the first round for that. They are next up in the 3rd position of the 2nd round. Houston followed by Indianapolis, then Atlanta, then Detroit. That'll be the 31st through 34th picks overall in this draft. Bill Walsh alluded to something earlier, Chris, when he was chatting live with Greg Wyatt, which was, and almost in passing, I think it bears repeating, and I know you went to the owners' meeting, the roster size that will change from, 49 active players to 45 this year?
Actually, it won't change. Nothing has been acted on yet, Bob, but the rule states in the NFL that you have 45 players per team. They voted in, especially the last 2 years, 49. Now the sentiment is to just leave it alone. They don't do anything. You're back to 45. Now, it seemed like the Oilers have a different problem. I mean, they just have to figure out who their best 45 guys are. But a team like the 49ers, they're now going to have to cut some quality players, some people that actually contributed to them winning the Super Bowl last year. They used almost the whole roster. So the very good teams, now comes your question in drafting in these middle rounds. Do you keep 3 quarterbacks? It's almost like a bullpen question in baseball. Or how many pitchers do you go if you're American League or National League? Do you keep 3 quarterbacks? Does this boost the stock of a Randall Cunningham because he can punt as well as being your 3rd quarterback? How deep can you go at each position? This is some of the things that coaches right now are agonizing over.
It's never been something I think that Bill Walsh agonized over, because after he won the Super Bowl back in '81, he made some changes and there were some new faces and people moved along. And I think he has shown the inclination. He might have a little remiss personally, but he'll make what changes have to be made.
We now have a new standard in the NFL. We now have something we can count on every year. Every time the San Francisco 49ers win the Super Bowl, they make a draft day trade with the New England Patriots. It was Russ Francis 3 years ago and all of that swapping around to get him in the picks. This year they make the trade with the Patriots and they come away with Jerry Rice. So look for it. Niners win the Super Bowl, they trade with the Patriots. Very simple. Mark it down.
The Oilers are on deck. We'll see if they go a thrice time for defense, to be followed by Indianapolis. We'll continue from here at the Sports Center and also from the Omni Park Central in New York and from San Francisco and Redwood City after this word.
Greg Wyatt with Howard Balzer. We're here with the world champion 49ers, and it was a very interesting first round for the Western teams in the NFC West and the AFC West. Nearly everybody got the Christmas presents they were looking for.
Oh, hopefully there'll be Christmas presents. Like we alluded to earlier, this was really a need draft, especially in the first round for those Western teams. The Raiders with the wide receiver they wanted, San Diego, the offensive tackle. Although, again, they were hoping that either Lomas Brown or Ken Rutgers were there. And then the big decision was whether to go to the next level of offensive tackle or go for some other position. They went for the tackle with Kevin Allen. Denver, an interesting pick late in the first round, with Steve Sewell, the running back from Oklahoma. And it's interesting because a few weeks ago, Dan Reeves was talking about making Gerald Wilhite more of a fullback and getting him more involved in the offense. And now they pick a guy like Sewell who can do a lot of different things. He can play halfback, he can play fullback, he's a good blocker. They can put him at wide receiver. He can even play the H-back position in the Broncos' one-back offense. So I think the Broncos were looking for that versatility with Sewell, and that was the reason for that pick.
The Raiders looking for a very big play receiver, and they certainly got it in Jesse Hester.
Well, they think they got it in Hester. There were a couple other receivers still sitting there, Vance Johnson from Arizona, Stacy Robinson from North Dakota State. But the Raiders really liked Hester, and they hope he's going to be the offense. The Rams, a lot of people thought they might go defensive end. Instead, they went more for an inside guy in Darrell Sims of Wisconsin, making 3 Wisconsin players in the first round. But the Rams need that help in the defense. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The Rams took Jerry Gray. Got a little backwards there. A little surprised, but I think Gray lasted a lot longer than people expected. Last year, Eric Harris was switched to safety from cornerback, and now the Rams decided you can't pass up a great athlete like Gray. And one of their concerns was the economic factor. I think the Rams were looking at whether a player drafted in the 21st position in the first round was worth the kind of big money they'd be asking. But Gray really projected as an earlier pick, and because of that, they probably think he was worth it.
And here in the West, watch Vince Ferragamo to Buffalo. It could happen as early here as the second round. Now let's go back to George Grant in New York.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll be heading back towards the West Coast to get an update from Greg and Howard a little bit later on. We are waiting now on Houston's selection, the number 3 pick in the second round of drafting of the National Football League Collegiate Player Draft. Already taken, in case you're just joining us, in the second round. Buffalo took Mark Trainowitz, the offensive lineman out of the University of Nebraska, and Minnesota took Isaac Holt, the defensive back out of Alcorn State. You know, we've been talking about the Southwest Athletic Conference and about some of the schools that have done well so far in the draft. We mentioned Wisconsin already has 3 draft picks so far through a round plus of competition. Pittsburgh has 2, USC has 2. You may not realize it, but the number 1 conference in drafting a year ago during the '84 draft was the Southwest Athletic Conference. 40 athletes were taken from the SWAC. during the course of last year's draft. That is more than the Pac-10, the Big Ten, or anybody else. It certainly gives you an indication of where a lot of the athletes are in the 1980s. Sam Rosen is standing by, back on the floor of the draft headquarters here at the Omni Park Central Hotel with more on this 85 draft.
Thank you, George. And with me is Brian Burwell of the New York Daily News, who covers football here in New York and around the East. And, Brian, your impressions of the first round thus far?
I think there have been about 2 or 3 big surprises. I think Chris Dolman going 4th in the draft. No one expected him to be in the top 10 or maybe top 15. Eddie Brown, the wide receiver from Miami, going that low. And like you were saying a few minutes ago, Mr. Perry William Perry going to Chicago, that's scary to think of him in the middle of that line with Hampton and Richard Dent.
If they can get him down and able to run a little bit.
Oh, yeah, I saw them list him as 305. I don't think he's been 305 since he's been 15 years old.
Turn the 5 and the 0 around, and you got more like it.
Yeah.
Your impressions of the Jets pick of Al Toon and the Giants pick of George Adams?
I like the Jets pick. I think you couldn't afford to pass Al Toon up. I don't think they expected him to drop down that far. And they need wide receiver help. I mean, they have Wesley Walker, and they have, you know, the guys they've had haven't done what they wanted them to do lately. So Al Toon is an excellent athlete, and I think it was a good pick.
Will they be able to pick up defensive help in switching to that 3-4 defense? Will they be able to pick up some defensive help in the 2nd and 3rd rounds?
We'll find out. There are people there, so we'll see if they can get it. They didn't get it last year. Farrow is going to be moved to a linebacker now, so maybe they will pick somebody up. They need to.
What about the Giants pick?
Surprise. George Adams is almost a clone of the guy they just signed from the Generals, Maurice Carthen. I don't know what their thinking is behind that. Maybe it's because Carthen is going to be coming off an 18-game schedule and may not be able to go through the entire year. He may be banged up. This guy maybe gives them some insurance. And let's face it, they haven't had too many good running backs, so one isn't always enough. But I am surprised that they took him. I figured they were going to go for a defensive lineman.
Thanks for being with us, Brian.
Okay.
Brian Burwell of the New York Daily News. Let's go back to George Grant.
Thank you very much, Sam. We are waiting on Houston's selection here in the 2nd round of the National Football League draft. First round completed 3 hours and 36 minutes. Other than 2 other times since the common draft started, it was the longest draft. Prior to that, there was a 3-hour and 45-minute first round in 74 and a 3-hour and 37-minute in 76. 3:36 was the time of the first round. Houston coming up. 3rd pick in the 2nd round. Zim, who are you looking at?
Well, I think it's got to be Mike Gann to play the nose or play the outside. They were even thinking of him about a week ago as their 2nd pick in the first round, and I think they're very surprised that he's there. So I see them defense all the way after going offense for 3 years.
Well, linebacker. I think they're going. I think that they need an inside linebacker, and I think that's what they're going to take.
You're not coming out of retirement.
When I went in forever, pal.
We're just under 4 minutes, 3:50 and change, waiting on the Houston selection. We're going to go to a break because you don't see it, but Zimmerman has a sandwich on his lap that he wants to get working on. We'll be back after a while.
Isaac has selected Isaac Holt, the defensive back from Alcorn State out of the Southwestern Athletic Conference. Let's see now what the Oilers will do, and let's also see if Zim has gotten half of that sandwich down.
Vance Johnson.
Just under 2 minutes, 1:46 and counting on the selection by Houston here in the 3rd round. When you're waiting 15 minutes at this point in time, is an athlete they're debating on, or is there some other discussion going on now?
Well, I don't think it's a trade. I think it's within their organization they're having a little conflict. Somebody is holding out very firmly for his player, and somebody else wants a different guy. I can't see how they could get by Gann here, but, you know, I've not had the most outstanding successes today.
We've got a little bit of time as we're down to 1:15 and counting now. So far, 1 round plus, biggest surprise for both of you. Paul?
Well, I've got to go with William Perry in Chicago. To me, that's without a doubt is the biggest surprise, because I just think that there are other players out there that are. He is an excellent athlete. He's going to be in the pros, and he's probably going to play a long time. And if he gets his weight down, there's no question. We've talked about that many times. But I just think that there are other players that are better than Perry. And if you're talking about, you're looking at an athlete and someone that can help the team, I would pick someone else besides him.
Jim?
Well, I think that was unusual, but to me, Big shocker was the 3 wide receivers going as low as they did. I thought all 3 of them could be going by the 10th pick.
Where we are right now, would you say there are 2 or 3 athletes who should have gone now that haven't gone? Do we have a Sean Farrell waiting late? Or
Sean Farrell. Well, the guy that I thought might go as a sleeper fairly early was this kid Vance Johnson, who did the very fast time.
Let's go back to Don Weiss.
Denver has acquired this pick from Houston in a trade and has selected Vance Johnson, wide receiver, Arizona. Indianapolis is up. Houston traded its second choice in this round to Denver for the 8th pick in the round obtained by Denver from Tampa Bay and Denver's own 5th round choice.
Okay, there you have it. Denver trades up with Houston to make the selection, the 3rd selection here in the 2nd round, taking Vance Johnson, the wide receiver out of Arizona, 5'10", 170 pounds. Here's a guy that does a little bit of everything for
Well, that's the guy that ran the phenomenally fast time that Paul McGuire doesn't believe at the Phoenix workout. A purported, an alleged 4.28. And supposedly Dallas went wild about that.
Well, if you ever, it's all hearsay when you say a 4.3.
I never did under 4.6 myself, so I can't comment.
4 minutes, 6. Denver, running back, now wide receiver. They're going strictly offense at this point, but they've always had an excellent defense at Denver, and that doesn't surprise me at all.
I think they must have a sleeper cornerback somewhere, because a big need was to get a corner, because a natural safety, Mike Harden, plays their right corner, and I thought that was a big problem.
Yeah.
Indianapolis will be going next. They have already selected Dwayne Bickett, the linebacker out of the University of Southern California. Their 2nd selection in the draft will be upcoming, the 4th selection of the 2nd round. Look at Vance Johnson, the wide receiver out of Arizona. A lot of the folks who had a chance to watch him in the Pac-10 season saw one fine athlete. And you can see he went both from a running back position, from a wing back position, also went out of the backfield to receive. Fine all-round athlete. He projects the wide receiver at the professional level, no doubt about that. He's not big, at 5'10", 172 pounds, but certainly the kind of guy with quickness and the ability to get open that the pros like.
I don't know why they showed that last run. It was a 1-yard gain.
Just so you can get a peek at him and try to time him with your watch while you're doing it.
I had the stopwatch on him. It took him a long time to get around that corner.
We're waiting on the Indianapolis Colts. We'll be back here at the Omni Park Central Hotel with their selection. Now let's go back to the ESPN headquarters in Bob Lee.
Wide receiver out of Arizona. Actually played some time at running back in college, and he'll be looking to join the Denver organization. Before the draft, we put that question to him. We talked to a lot of seniors in college. What can you bring to your new pro team?
I think the main thing I have that I can give to a professional football team is my speed. And I've heard that I'm one of the fastest guys coming out of college this year. And I've been running tailback all through my 4 years in college. I'll be a wide receiver when I get drafted, though.
Maybe he didn't run a 4.28, but we have him down as a 4.41, an outstanding track athlete. A real spark plug. Was a 100-yard sprinter in 9.6 when he was in high school. Held his high school records in long jump and also the 100 and 200-yard dash and state champion. A lot of the credentials a lot of speedsters bring. So Denver antes up even further with the offense.
Well, Denver, of course, you never go wrong with Denver if you're going to give Elway a couple of guys to throw the ball to now, Sewell and Vance Johnson. And it's interesting, Vance Johnson, a guy that is way under 6 feet, but in this day and age, that's no problem at that position.
It's not, and it's very rare, Chris, that you, excuse me, it's very rare that you see a wide receiver with the rare speed, the 4.4 speed. You know, Zim mentioned 4.28, which was accurate, by the way, with the hands and a good consistency. And I think when you look at him, the thing that he lacks is the toughness. But when you move him out there with the rule changes, you know, you can get by with a 5'10", 170-pound receiver. We see that with the Miami guys. We've seen it with the Smurfs at the Washington. So I think Vance Johnson will fit in very well with Denver. It's a position they needed to fill.
All right, and of course, Indianapolis is next up. Indianapolis, Atlanta, Detroit, and then Cleveland finally gets their first crack at it because the Browns losing that pick a long, long while ago because Chip Banks was AWOL. The Buffalo Bills couldn't find him. Sorry, they got the pick back. So Cleveland kind of waiting at the bit here, Bob.
They haven't picked yet. And also, if you're scoring with us at home, Houston will be selecting the 8th team in the second round by virtue of the trade that just gave Denver the chance to take Vance Johnson. And Buffalo will be selecting in the 13th position in this draft. That was the trade earlier in the day by which Ken Rutgers was drafted by Green Bay. The Green Bay selection went to Buffalo. That's where we stand early in round 2. No players have been traded yet, just draft positions, waiting for some more surprises. That's the scene in San Francisco. They've taken speedster Jerry Rice. The Omni Park Central, the Colts.
Selects on the second round Donald Anderson, defensive back, Purdue.
Don Anderson,
Atlanta,
defensive back out of Purdue, selected by Indianapolis, going with their earlier selection of Dwayne Bickett, the linebacker from USC. So a couple of Colt defensive changes and defensive moves. Now this draft, if you can figure that 1983 was the year of the quarterback and there was a great preponderance towards offensive players. In fact, the first round of the 1983 draft, 18 offensive players were taken. It swung just about opposite, an equal amount in the opposite direction last year. As we mentioned earlier, an even 14-14 split between offense and defense in today's first round, with 6 offensive players, 6 defensive players, defensive lineman players, I should say, taken, 6 offensive linemen, 4 running backs, 4 wide receivers. And among the teams that have not yet selected, well, no picks in the first round for the Seahawks and for the Cleveland Browns and for Washington. Cleveland is upcoming shortly. In fact, they'll be the 7th pick in the second round. They have some needs. They have been busy. They lost that first-round pick because Chip Banks did not report to the Buffalo Bills. David Sullivan will give us a look at the state of mind in the Cleveland camp as they approach this draft day 1985. David?
So the Cleveland Browns have struck it rich in the Bernie Kosar sweepstakes. And the best part of the deal is that other than losing the services of Pro Bowler Chip Banks, who's expected to go to Buffalo as part of the deal to get the #1 selection in the supplemental draft, that other than that, the Browns' 1985 draft remains intact. Cleveland will be looking to spend the 7th overall selection in the regular draft on either a speedy wide receiver to capitalize on Kosar's talent or a powerful blocker to keep the former Hurricane out of harm's way. Kosar is indeed a natural solution to the puzzle that has been Paul McDonald. The Browns, starting right at the top with Art Modell, are so taken with the possibilities represented by fulfilling Kosar's boyhood ambitions of playing quarterback for his local team that there is little chance to recall what happened the last time the Browns traded up in the opening round of the draft to ensure the selection of a top quarterback prospect. Dolphin fans have little trouble remembering. Neither will Paul Warfield, now a member of the Browns front office. Cleveland not only sent Warfield to the Dolphins, but running back Ron Johnson to the Giants as part of a 3-team deal which secured the services of Homer Jones, as well as Miami's first-round selection in the 1970 draft, which was utilized to choose Mike Phipps. Optimistic Brown fans have little use for such painful reminders. Instead, they prefer to visualize Bernie Kosar matching the accomplishments of his predecessor at Miami, Jim Kelly, not to mention the potential to perform like a Dan Marino. Marty Schottenheimer and his staff are far more realistic. Unless they can obtain immediate assistance for an offensive line that was devastated in the wake of Cody Risen's severe knee injury, it won't matter who throws the football in Cleveland, since very few NFL passers are able to complete touchdown passes from the prone position.
Thank you, David. David filed that draft history of the Cleveland Browns prior, of course, to the last day in which Cleveland had the 7th pick. It reverted to Buffalo because Chip Banks, involved in the Kosar deal, did not report to the Bills, so Buffalo had the selection. They then traded that #7 selection to Green Bay, and Ken Rutgers was the Packers selection. The selection just made by the Colts. We're waiting on Atlanta now, still 15 minutes per selection. We're in the second round early on. Don Anderson, the quarterback, defensive secondary player from Purdue, going to Indianapolis, a man who started 4 years for the Boilermakers and as a high school runner set all sorts of state records because he's got 4.47 speed.
He's a great athlete, Bob. He played better this year than he did in the past. The thing that bothers me about Anderson is he's got the great speed and he's an athlete, but he's usually in a position to make the play and he doesn't come down with the interception or he doesn't bat the pass down. Here he comes up with it, but on a consistent basis he doesn't. And that worries me because he just doesn't show that awareness, that ball awareness and coverage that you really look for in a top player. Although his athletic ability is outstanding, and he figured to go in the early to mid-second round, so it was a decent choice. Although with players like John Henry and Wayne Davis on the board, they probably had, as far as I'm concerned, slightly more ability. He does fill a position of need for the Colts, though, Chris.
Sorry, Mel. No, let's face it, the Colts, just about every position is a position of need for them. And, of course, last year they drafted the young man that went off to the United States Football League, Leonard Coleman, and they did not sign him. So there you see where he is projected to Glasgow, for instance, and Randall, some of the players that Anderson may be trying to compete with to beat out for a starting job with the Indianapolis Colts. And the Colts, well, interesting. A lot of people said Rod Dowhour wouldn't even look at defense for 4 or 5 rounds, and he just wants offense, offense, offense. But what the heck? He's a head football coach, and he knows that 50 points sometimes doesn't even win you games these days.
You got to stop them. Atlanta is next up. Bill Fralick was their first selection. In fact, if you've just joined us, Atlanta working a trade with Minnesota early on in this draft. They move up from 4 to number 2, and to use that selection for Bill Fralick. And the Falcons had only that one selection in the first round. The clock is running on Atlanta, and we'll see what their selection will be. We are early in the second round. ESPN's live coverage for the 6th consecutive year of the National Football League draft continues after this. League draft continues on ESPN here on the Sports Center, along with Chris Berman and Mel Kiper Jr. I'm Bob Lee. The 33rd pick of the draft, that's what we are awaiting right now with Atlanta, followed by Detroit, and then Cleveland, and then Houston, if you're scoring with us at home. A pick originally Tampa Bay's, and then Denver. As we get into the early second round, and we begin to see if there are any patterns when teams acquire their second and third picks of the draft, where are they going? How astutely have they scouted? It all goes back to 1964. Steve Sable remembers what happened when Washington drafted oh so wisely that year. Steve?
Here in the NFL Films Vault, you'll find the footage of the greatest players in the game. And obviously, it's the hope of every club that they'll draft a future pro star when they pick from the college talent pool. Some teams have been able to grab 2 Hall of Famers in a single draft, such as the Bears in 1965 when they drafted Gale Sayers and Dick Butkus. Another team was just as fortunate in 1964. That was when the Washington Redskins hit the draft's version of the Daily Double.
You'd have to say the Redskins' 1964 draft was a capital investment. In the first round, they picked Arizona State running back Charlie Taylor. In the second round, they selected Paul Krause from Iowa. In his rookie season, Krause, number 26, intercepted a league-high 12 passes. Krause went on to play 16 years with the Redskins and Minnesota Vikings and retired with 81 interceptions, the most in league history. Taylor, number 42, began the 1964 season as a running back and rushed for enough yards to become NFL Rookie of the Year. But his pass-catching abilities were just too good to ignore. The following year, the Redskins made him a receiver, and for the next 13 seasons, he caught more passes than anyone in football. Taylor left the game with 649 receptions, a record that was finally broken by San Diego's Charlie Joyner in 1984. Until then, the Redskins could claim the distinction of having selected the NFL's all-time leading receiver and all-time interceptor in the same draft.
You can say as many times as you like that the draft is simply one part of the player personnel process. You've got trades, you've got free agency and the waiver wires, but you've got to know, George, that deep within each general manager and head scout and player personnel director, they'd like to emulate what Washington did, whether they knew what they were doing or not in 1964 with a couple of Hall of Famers. And as we close in on Atlanta's pick, George?
Right, Bob. You know, this may be a time where somebody can take a chance. We're just talking about Atlanta and sitting here, and I don't think you could say it's logical, and it's certainly not probable. But looking at the Atlanta Falcons quarterback situation, maybe this is a time to take a dip for one. They've got Barkowski, who is not signed yet. They have signed Ben Bennett, but the situation is a little bit unsettled.
They have a backup that you've never heard of named David Archer that they like very much. It depends who's doing the drafting. If Dan Henning is doing it, I would say no. You don't start when you're hanging by a thread, you know, and you don't have a 5-year contract. You don't start rebuilding a club with a young quarterback. He's hoping that they either sign Barkowski or they trade for one. But if somebody else is handling the draft, Tom Bratz, Eddie LeBaron, somebody else has input, then they could take a young quarterback.
And there's still a question, too, with Atlanta. You're talking about William Andrews now, that they don't know whether he is going to be able to come back out that knee surgery. And if that's the case, now maybe we'll get to Greg Allen. You think that's a possibility? Is that a possibility?
No.
It's not a possibility, so let's do something with Sam, maybe.
Greg Allen, of course, we've been waiting on from Florida State to find a running back who had knee difficulties himself and did not become a draftee during the course of the first round, may come up during the course of this second round. In the meantime, speaking of guys who were fine physical specimens and great athletes in their day, Irv Cross is standing by with Sam Rosen. Irv, of course, now with CBS.
Get some fine specimens at the table.
Irv was a little better athlete than I was and wound up playing 9 years in the NFL. Irv, where are the stars of this NFL draft?
Well, you know, I was waiting for the quarterbacks and the great running backs to flash, but that's not going to happen in this year's draft. But you've got some pretty good linemen up there. And of course, Buffalo's, everybody knows, picked up Bruce Smith, and the young man who's not only had great talent and great pass rusher, but loves to eat. He's a gourmet cook.
Well, he's a big guy. I think they're going to have to watch his weight up there.
Well, it's always a concern. You know, we used to have a running joke in the league that you could eat yourself off of a ball club. As funny as it sounds, it could happen. You know, he's 275 pounds or so, and he's going to have to trim down and work to try to stay at that weight. If you very well blow up to 300 pounds, it could have a problem.
Now, you talk to a lot of coaches and scouts. How much do they look into a guy's character, his motivational abilities, and things like that?
You know, you hear this a lot. Do you play for the money or do you play for other reasons? I really think that today's athletes, the athletes of the past, play because they really love to play the game. Okay, the money's important. Don't discount that. The money's important, but you have to, first of all, be a competitor. I think everybody looks at that. You know, how hungry is the athlete? You know, one of the things, again, we did years ago, we take our #1 draft choice and put him against one of our star players to see how he'd react. If he's a big lineman, normally they have their own way in college. He's 6'6", 6'7", 280 pounds or so. And you put him against a big, experienced offensive lineman or defensive lineman in the pros, and you see how he reacts to that. And you'd be surprised the number of people the first time they get stung have a negative reaction. And you might have had a bad draft choice.
Getting back to the overall picture of the draft, and there not being that many glamour people in the draft, is it a cyclical type thing? Will next year be the glamour year? Will we go back to that more running backs and more quarterbacks coming out?
Well, you know, Sam, you have more and more teams drafting fewer and fewer quality players. You know, I think that's what we're probably talking about. There are a lot of college players out there coming to the draft every year, but every time the league expands, every time you have competition from other people looking for talented athletes, you know, the talent pool is just kind of thin. We were talking before going to this interview that when I was drafted in '61, I was drafted as a 7th-round draft choice, and I got a laugh about that, but heck, there are only 12 teams in the league and 33 ball players in the club then. So when you look at now what you have in terms of the universe of athletes you need, when you get in the draft is a very vital source of talent, obviously, but, you know, the picks become pretty thin.
Irv, thanks for being with us.
All right, thanks for having me.
We'll see you on the NFL Today. Irv Cross of CBS Sports. Now let's go back to George Grant.
Thank you very much, Sam. We are waiting on the Atlanta Falcons. We are down under a minute, and there has been some scuttlebutt going back and forth that there may be a deal brewing. That could possibly be with the Washington Redskins. The Redskins are scheduled to pick 23rd in this round, and right now Atlanta is up in the #5 position. Don Weiss is ready with either the pick or some possible news. That's Dick Maxwell with him, and obviously they've been by the table talking for a couple of minutes, so there may be something working. Dick checking his pad, his clipboard, and Don Weiss waiting on a decision. Al Ward, also from the NFL.
Al Ward is the guy who checks the players' length of socks and uniforms. He's checking all the writers to make sure their socks are the right color.
Detroit's up. Okay, if there was a deal working, it has not been enacted as yet. Atlanta passes. The Detroit Lions are up next. The Lions have already taken Lomas Brown, the offensive tackle from the Florida Gators. This, their only selection of the 2nd round coming up. And here's an interesting situation, because you've got a new coach in Darryl Rogers. He fired the man who normally ran the draft, so you've got a little bit of a new situation in Detroit.
You know, he wanted Bickett on the 1st round, couldn't get him. I think now he has to be concerned about a runner because of Billy Sims' knee. Of course, you got Greg Allen, you got another guy who's got an iffy knee, but he's got practically the whole board of the running backs. He's got a big back in Jones, who's a good player, but I mean, it looks like a scat back type.
That's because, of course, Billy Sims is still somewhat of a question mark after the knee injury this past year.
Yeah, exactly.
What kind of a situation is it in Detroit with a Monty Clark gone and a Rooney gone? How's that affecting it?
Tumultuous. Russ Thomas, a lot of power.
Let's get this. Ron Nixon,
the trade will be announced shortly.
Defensive back from San Diego State, Don Weiss making that announcement now. That, again, I didn't quite get whether that was, yes, that was Atlanta. That was Atlanta. It was Atlanta taking Nixon, the defensive back from San Diego State. I wasn't sure it was Detroit or Atlanta. It was Atlanta. We'll check it out and make sure we get the bottom line of it. And when we return after this timeout, we'll give you the 4th, 5th, and 6th picks of this 1985 National Football League draft. On that trade, it was a trade between Atlanta and Washington, as we had heard, as the scuttlebutt was indicating, and the Atlanta Falcons do get the running back that they were looking for, but it is not through the draft. Atlanta sends their 2nd in 85, their 2nd in 86, and their 6th round draft choice in 86 to Washington. Washington sends Atlanta their 2nd in 85, their 2nd in 86, and also running back Joe Washington. So there you have running back Joe Washington going to the Atlanta Falcons. That's the first player transaction of the day, although we have had a number of trades going back and forth. And with their selection, Washington took Torrey Nixon, the defensive back out of San Diego State. So that updates you on the Atlanta position and the draft by Washington. Detroit is up next. There's about 11 minutes left on the clock in that one. Greg Wyatt is standing by with Howard Balzer out on the West Coast as we continue to update from the West this 85 draft.
Boy, very interesting. Little Joe going to Atlanta, huh?
Well, of course, you look back at Washington and the trade they made last week with New Orleans, getting Joe Rogers. There's the injury questions, of course, with John Riggins. Also injury questions with Joe Washington. And so they made that deal. And Washington, wheeling and dealing, as Bobby Beathard always does on draft day, certainly came away with a pretty good deal with New Orleans for George Rogers. And now they get rid of Joe Washington, and they're looking pretty good to try to return to the top of the NFC East.
Year 1 of Alex Spanos as owner of the Chargers, and of course the Chargers are notorious for horrible first-round draft picks, but they got a good one right now in Jim Lachey from Ohio State.
Earlier I said Kevin Allen, with all those offensive tackles getting picked, it started confusing teams, but it was Jim Lachey who the Chargers did pick, the big tackle. Some people project him as a guard, so he might be able to play at either position. And, of course, the Chargers with an offensive line that had injury problems, getting a little old with Ed White and Doug Wilkerson. So they needed that. I think the other teams in the AFC West realizes the way to get to Dan Fouts and to make him throw in incompletions is to get to Dan Fouts. And they've been able to do that in the last couple of years. And, of course, the result was Dan Fouts getting injured. So I think that was one of the key factors there with San Diego realizing they had to upgrade that offensive line.
Interesting news coming out of Anaheim, and that's that Eric Dickerson has switched agents. I would not want to tell his new one that he's an awful one because he is Ken Norton, former heavyweight champion.
Ken Norton, that should be an interesting negotiation when he goes in to talk about Eric. He wants a lot more money. He broke O.J. Simpson's record last year. Now saw the Rams bring in a quarterback, Dieter Brock, from Canada, who's making more than him. So it's going to be an interesting renegotiation. The Rams also have Jerry Gray, who they picked in the first round. He's going to be expecting a lot of money. So it's going to be interesting to watch. Supposedly, Dickerson turned down a $1 million check from John Bassett last week when Bassett is going on his alleged spending spree, signing up all these players, Wendell Tyler, an agreement for 1986, but no contract has been signed yet by Wendell. So Dickerson has supposedly turned that down. Now, he wants to stay in L.A., but it's going to take some bucks to make him stay.
Howard and I are here with the world champion San Francisco 49ers. Now let's go back to Bobby Lee in Bristol.
Thanks very much, Greg. And so Washington, in that trade with Atlanta, has selected Torrey Nixon. Detroit is next up, to be followed by Cleveland. Then, if you're scoring with us at home, the 8th selection overall in the second round will be Houston's, originally Tampa Bay's, then sent in the DeBerg deal to Denver, then Houston. And let's now get the selection of what's happening with Cleveland, I should say Detroit, on deck. And Don Weiss is at the podium at the Omni Park Central. This will be pick number 34 overall.
Detroit, on the second round, has selected Kevin Glover, center, Maryland.
And so the third offensive player of the second round has been selected. Kevin Glover, a center out of Maryland, has been drafted by Detroit, the number 6 hole. To recap that other trade, the only other effect that you will see from that trade this year, the trade that was just happening between Washington and Atlanta, later on in the second round, the selection number 23 in this round, number 51 overall, Washington's pick is now Atlanta's pick. And if I recall correctly, it's the second time Joe Washington has been traded on draft day. I think 3 or 4 years ago he was involved in a draft day deal. And so now Washington goes for Torrin Nixon, a cornerback out of San Diego State. And transferred in from Phoenix Junior College, began right away for the Aztecs, a reckless kind of player.
He is, and he's a very intelligent player. You know, Bobby Beathard likes San Diego State defensive backs. He drafted Vernon Dean in the second round a few years back. He may have drafted Nixon with the intention of moving Dean to a safety spot. Nixon would then team with speedy little diminutive corner Darrell Green. So if you look at Nixon, he's a very intelligent player, has great speed, not very big, but he hits, good football player. You know, some people project him as a first rounder. I looked at him as a mid-second and early in the second round, a good choice for Bobby Beathard. Like I said, 2 San Diego State players in the secondary now for the Redskins.
While Torrin Nixon, playing at quarterback, also had some experience in the junior college ranks, going out to the Washington Redskins, and we posed that question to him at a combine workout about the adjustments he would have to make. Now he'll be moving on to play with the Washington Redskins.
Well, I think to adapt more to playing man-on-man coverage. At San Diego, we played a little bit, but we played primarily zone, and I think the NFL and the USFL plays mainly man-to-man, and to be a good man-to-man cover.
And so Torrin Nixon, the cornerback out of San Diego State, man-to-man coverage, grading out at a 15.8. His top grade on his quickness, because he does have 4 or 5 speed, the low grade of coming up to force against the run. We're waiting for Cleveland to make their selection. In fact, that will be their initial selection in this draft this year. And we'll be stepping aside for just a moment. The National Football League draft live on ESPN continues with the Browns on deck, to be followed by the Oilers. As he approaches this draft day 85.
Well, of course, the main thing we've got to concentrate our efforts in respect to is getting our offense in gear. That was probably our biggest enigma overall. Our defense came on and played very strong and really helped us. Our special teams did well also. So I think that's where we're going to have to center our attention. And, of course, we're looking in that quarterback department in terms of a young quarterback. We've got to improve the quality of our offensive line play so we can move the ball in respect to our running game. But I think if we can step up offensively, and assuming, of course, that our defense continues to do as well as it did last year, particularly from mid-season on, you know, I'm optimistic. I think that we can be a contender in our division.
Well, Lynn mentioned the offensive line, and in the first round, Kevin Allen was the selection, the offensive tackle out of Indiana. And Mel, you and I were talking about 2-3 weeks before the draft when the Kozar situation was still very much up in the air, very fluid situation. And your opinion at that point was that the Eagles would be in the thick of it and may come out the winners in the Kozar sweepstakes. It didn't happen that way, but they were looking towards the quarterback through that avenue.
They were, and I think they will still look for a young quarterback. You know, there's rumors are high on Steve Bono from UCLA. Of course, Frank Reich, Calabria, we haven't had a quarterback drafted yet. They could opt for a quarterback sometime, either in the second or third round. They also need help at other positions. So there's a team here. You know, they help their offensive line, obviously, but they need help at other positions. So it's interesting to see what they do, Chris.
Well, how about the Browns now? This is really their number 1 pick, if you will, because of the bank situation. And you look down the wide receiver list, they still got to get Bernie somebody to throw the ball to opposite Ozzie Newsome at the tight end. How about Chris Burkett, big 6'4", maybe 6'4.5" from Jackson State with really good speed. I mean, he's built like Toon, I guess. He's not quite in Toon's category. Let's take a shot there. That makes sense to you?
Makes sense, although coming from a small program like in the Southwestern Athletic Conference, you know, causes some concern. He has good hands, but not great hands. You mentioned Toon. You know, he compares favorably size-wise, but he's a little raw, and he needs development. He's not the kind of player who's going to come right in and start for you. I think another player you can consider here is a speed receiver, Stacy Robinson from North Dakota State, who a lot of people figured to go first round. I thought he would be an early second. He's still here. Possibility. Also, Cleveland, you talked about Kosar, somebody to throw to. They also need somebody to keep those defenders off his back. So they could come up with an offensive lineman here. But you have to remember, Cleveland does not have a 3rd, 4th, or 5th round selection, which is really going to hurt in this draft.
Better be careful with this one. Now, we hadn't make a selection in a while, Bob. We had to get it in there. You know?
Okay, Cleveland next up, followed by Houston. And also that Atlanta trade with Washington. Joe Washington, now a member of Atlanta, a very convoluted trade. And of the, well, so far 4 or 5 trades, in fact 5 trades that have been made today, George Grant was the first trade that involved a real live NFL veteran.
That's right, Bob, and let's recap it for you to make it clear and concise, because there was some confusion up at the podium and confusion around the room, so let's make sure that you fully understand it from top to bottom. It was a trade between Atlanta and the Washington Redskins. Atlanta sends to Washington its 2nd pick in 1985. That pick turned out to be Torrin Nixon, nicknamed Torrey. His name, odd spelling, T-O-R-R-A-N, Torrin Nixon, defensive back out of San Diego State. Atlanta also sent to Washington a second and sixth round pick in 1986. Washington sending to Atlanta second round pick in 85, which they of course made. Then the first round in 86, first round pick in 86, plus Joe Washington. The question you have to be left with is, you got one limping running back, you don't know how William Andrews is, and Paul, you pick up another one. The question is, how physically fit is Joe Washington?
Well, I mean, how much longer can Joe Washington stand up? He was mainly used by the Redskins as a receiver coming out of the backfield, not specifically as a runner, because they had Riggins. I just, you know, with George Rogers, you know, now they got their running back. So I just don't know what this trade meant, except that in 1986, the Atlanta Falcons get their #1 draft choice in Washington.
Let's go back to the podium and Don Weiss.
Cleveland Browns, second round selection.
Got to be offensive line.
Greg Allen, running back, Florida State. Houston is up on a choice from Tampa Bay through Denver. Houston is up.
Well, they had projected Greg Allen for the first round, but I guess we talked about the knee injury, and maybe that was one of the reasons why he lasted this long into the second round, Sam.
Yeah, it's one of those attractive draft choices. Second round, they got a runner who could be great. Maybe problems, but could be great. In the meantime, they have no offensive lineman.
Richard Byrd, Southern Mississippi.
Okay, just
Houston
selected.
Selects Richard Byrd, defensive end, Southern Mississippi. Philadelphia is up.
This is Houston's selection. The number 8 selection of the round. It's Richard Byrd, B-Y-R-D, defensive end of Southern Mississippi. Greg Allen has been taken, the running back of Florida State, by Cleveland, and Kevin Glover, the center of Maryland, was taken by Detroit. We are now waiting on the Philadelphia Eagles and their selection, which is the 9th selection here in the second round. Sam Rosen is standing by with Rudy Martzke of USA Today.
No is the sports TV columnist for USA Today. And Rudy, let's get tomorrow's news today. How are we doing?
You guys right now, at least a 6, maybe a 7. It's, as many people have written, it's a draft of very few big names, and I think ESPN's taken a right approach of making it fun. I think it was a good move bringing Paul McGuire in to sit there and go back and forth with Paul Zimmerman, and I think that's been a real plus. And I think Mel Kiper again has shown that he knows what's going on in this draft.
Rudy, let's talk a little about football on television. Where does it have to go? What changes do you think might be made to make it more enjoyable to the fans viewing?
I think the key to television football is how the analyst projects. And it's always much more fun watching a telecast when you're watching an interesting analyst and he brings out a lot of points or some humor that you're not. I always want to be told something I don't know, and that's what makes guys like John Madden very good. And Paul McGuire here on ESPN.
Listening, McGuire, you're doing a good job. He said it right here. Rudy, as far as the game is concerned, does it have to be speeded up a little bit, as they've been talking about? Should there be, what about the use of replays? Will that help fans' viewership?
Replays won't help at all. I mean, let's say the USFL experiment has not been a success as much as they want to say it has. Nobody's talking about it anymore because, of course, the league is no longer very important. But, and the NFL will try, but I think whatever they can do to speed up the game will be great. I mean, to get it down to that 3-hour mark or right in there, because now it's 9 or 10 minutes over.
Rudy, thanks for being with us, and maybe by the end of the day we'll get it from a 6 or a 7 up to an 8 or a 9.
Okay, sir.
Rudy Martzke of USA Today. We'll be back with more coverage of the 1985 NFL Draft in just a moment.
Scoring as a sophomore, had all those touchdowns, well over 20. Can he handle on to the football? Does he drop it too much for your taste, Mel?
That's the problem. The fumbling problems, has really cropped up year in and year out. Another thing, too, you mentioned this year he had some injury problems, took a back seat to Roosevelt Snipes, a highly rated junior there. The one thing about Allen, he's an outstanding elusive runner. As a receiver, he's good, but he's not great. So you have to know what you're getting there. He'll block and, look at his grades there, which are good. like I said, I thought he would be a late first round. I think the knee injury shied some teams away. They went with Miami, went with Hampton probably ahead of Allen for that reason. You know, look at his numbers are good, but I was surprised that Cleveland went for him. I thought they were okay at running back, but what had probably happened here, Bob, was he was probably just the best player on the board for Cleveland at that time.
Well, Houston made the selection after that one. It's been a defensive draft for Houston. It continued with defensive end, defensive tackle Richard Byrd out of Southern Mississippi. Houston's selection in the second round. Very, very tough worker. He'll never cheat you a moment in practice, and in fact, as strong as they come, he can play, in fact, has played just about everywhere along that line, at nose and at tackle and at end as well, right?
It's a great player to have on your roster, Bob. He can play really anywhere. You look at, Childress and Byrd moving in is really going to strengthen their defensive front. They lost Doug Smith to the USFL last year. Of course, they added Richard Johnson, a cornerback, which they need. They're on their way to really strengthen that defense, and they have some great young talent on offense, and if Moon comes along, that's a team to watch in the coming years. I think that Central Division could be strong. Cleveland builds up with Kosar, and of course Pittsburgh's always there, and Cincinnati's got a good young team.
Are they looking, I guess, for a linebacker and picks upcoming, and they're also looking for maybe a wide receiver to go opposite Timmy Smith? They are not that, well, not that far away from the Super Bowl. Yeah, they are, but they aren't that far away from being a force. The month of December, they played pretty well. They beat a couple of teams, and they have done it by the draft. I mean, there is your blueprint. If you want to say, how do you do it by the draft? Those offensive players, those offensive linemen, the last couple of years, this year they said they were going defense. They weren't blowing smoke. They're exactly right.
Childress defensive end, defensive back, Richard Johnson, and Richard Byrd selected just moments ago, early in the second round. Defense. Well, they say that Tom Bass knows as much about it as anybody about the defensive difficulties. A player coming in from the college to the pro ranks. Tom Bass of the Chargers.
Well, there's a big transition. Number one, the biggest transition, of course, is the length of the season. Because, when we play our 12th game, the young college kid is ready to, go to Christmas vacation, and we're still got 8 more games to go. So that's a tough thing for them. But just some mental work. I think the mental work is the hardest thing for them. They're not used to playing football or practicing football or studying football with the greatest intensity. They don't have the time in college because of their classroom work. So, but in our profession, it's a full-time job, and so they have to study off the field. They have to take the film home. They have to have their own projector and those things, and that takes a while for a young player to learn.
Among all the defensive coordinators in football, Tom Bass may be the best known simply by his physiognomy there on the sideline, the poet, of course. But I've got to wonder, from the results that the Chargers have gotten defensively, if the pressure is not on. Yeah. Certainly a losing season last year, and the defense had to bear a large part of the blame.
Well, they've been drafting defense. They got unlucky a couple places. They didn't sign Mossy last year, and a couple other things didn't work out at cornerback. But all the defense they drafted, they still ranked 26th out of 28 teams last year, and the pressure has to be on, especially in that division where 8-8 puts you like last place.
Philadelphia is next up. The Eagles have 4.5 minutes to make their selection. Then the New Orleans Saints once again. And then San Diego as we approach the halfway mark of the second round of the National Football League draft on ESPN. And we'll continue right after this.
9 seasons with the Patriots after being their first-round pick in 1973.
Don Weiss explaining Randall Cunningham's selection and also the family connection to Sam Bam at Philadelphia. And, strike up the band. We have our first quarterback selected. And is it a surprise? I think it is that it was Cunningham as number 1. You'd have to believe so. He is a multifaceted athlete. We talked about the smaller roster sizes. He can do a number of things for your team.
I would say a lot of people, Mel, will have to be surprised that he is the first one. A lot of people project Cunningham as a real project, but a guy with great natural ability. It takes a long time to get rid of the ball, but while he's learning behind 2 veterans, Jaworski and Pisarcik, if they choose to keep three, he can certainly punt the football, although he's never punted that much. It's not as if he's been punting 10, 12 times a game for Nevada, Las Vegas. What do you think of him?
I'll tell you, you wonder why he went this early ahead of some other quarterbacks. Well, Blesto, the one combine that the Eagles belonged to, had him raised the top quarterback in this draft. And the Eagles belonged to that combine. Obviously, they went for him with the intention of also using him as a punter. Like you were talking about earlier, saving a spot on the roster. He has some deficiencies in his mechanics, but that can come, you look for improvement from coaching there. As a punter, he should be able to step right in for him. He's a great athlete and an all-around type player. And like I said, that one combine did have him raised the top quarterback in this draft. I disagree with that. I thought Calabria and Reich had more talent, but, you know, they did need a quarterback. Since they filled their need, and they came up with a punter to boot.
Well, he can certainly move. He's been signed at 4'7", and, you know, I've also heard him say if it doesn't work out there, he could even play free safety. He's that good an athlete, and he has that speed, and certainly at 6'4", he has that size. Now, I'm not saying the Eagles will throw it in after 3 years and put him at free safety, but have you heard that? Is that a possibility?
I don't think so. I think they're looking at him as a backup quarterback right now and possibly somebody who can develop into a starter down the road for him and also use him as a punter. So they're going to get their value out of Cunningham right away with the hope that he develops and corrects those technical flaws in his delivery.
And he is definitely the new type of quarterback. I don't want to put him on a par with a guy like Montana, but he is obviously a mobile quarterback. He is not a sit back in the pocket like Jaworski or Pisarcik, the guys that they have now. So that will be a little bit different, and maybe with the line that they've had, they'll need a mobile-type quarterback.
Indeed, because his top grade on the scouting combine, 4.5, was for the agility. His low grade was for Reed, so maybe a bit of a project, but there is football success in the genes and certainly in the blood. Randall Cunningham, the brother of Sam Bam Cunningham, we talked to him about the influence that his older brother had on his career, now that Randall has been selected in the second round by the Eagles.
Well, my brother's contributed a lot. As far as the agents are concerned, he helped me pick an agent. He's helped me develop my leaderships. He made sure that I went to the boys' clubs when I was young. I went to the boys' club each day because he did. And I feel that they put a lot into my life. And one of these days, I'd like to go back and administer a boys' club and help young kids out, as my brother did help me get into the boys' club. And I really would like to do that because I feel I owe it to them to bring a little bit back for what they've done for me.
Well, some nice sentiment from Randall Cunningham. Both picks made so far by the Philadelphia Eagles today have been offensive. That one, Randall Cunningham and Kevin Allen, offensive tackle out of Indiana. And the clock is rolling on New Orleans, about to make the 38th pick, the 10th pick in the second round, the 38th pick overall, to be followed by San Diego, then the Jets, and then Buffalo, by virtue of the deal earlier today with Green Bay. There have been 5 trades made today, but only one active veteran player involved. Joe Washington has been traded from Washington Redskins to the Atlanta Falcons. That's where we stand early in round 2. We'll continue, send you back to New York, and see whether the selection of the first quarterback may have begun something. We have yet to see the USFL enter the picture today, so we continue with our live coverage on ESPN. Today, the Jets have made one pick. It was for Al Toon. Of all the wide receivers in this draft, well, Toon went ahead of the young man Eddie Brown from Miami, so the Jets have already made one selection. What are their other needs? Might it be linebacking? Well, David Sullivan has a look at what the Jets have done and what their needs are now here in the second round.
Jet fans will have little trouble recalling the team's approach to the draft at the onset of the Joe Walton era. Mike Hickey, the club's highly regarded personnel ace, was widely quoted as saying that the team that had come with a muddy field and 14 points of a Super Bowl berth was hardly in need of a major overhaul. Hickey described the first-round selection of Ken O'Brien as the equivalent of shopping at Tiffany's. Then there was last year's exodus of from the comfort zone as Walton and Hickey concurred in the exile of veterans such as Richard Todd, Chris Ward, Kenny Neal, Abdul Salam, and company. At first, such moves were hailed as a major factor in the team's 6-2 start. However, the Jets stumbled through a complete reversal of form in the second half of the campaign. Walton then bid farewell to defensive boss Joe Gardy, as well as linebacker mentor Ralph Baker. And now the Jets will invest their premium draft selections with an eye toward upgrading and linebacking contingent that has been weakened by costly injuries to former #1 pick Bob Crable, as well as the chronic knee problems of Greg Buttle. The shift to a 3-4 alignment will also necessitate shifting Joe Klecko to nose tackle, where his knee problems are apt to be even more painful. Similar injuries have robbed Marty Lyons of much of his effectiveness as well.
Back in New York City at the Omni Park Central Hotel, we are now into the second round and waiting for our 12th pick of the round. Just concluded moments ago, Darren Gilbert, a tackle out of Cal State Fullerton, was selected by the New Orleans Saints. San Diego, right after that, within 30 seconds of that, selected Wayne Davis, a defensive back of Indiana State. Those 2 picks have already been made. The New York Jets are up next. And Zim, as you look at it, how do you see it coming?
Mike Gann will not last through this pick. I'll bet any of your listeners right now, Mike Gann will not go past this pick.
All right, you got something going there.
Well, I'm not worried about him because he's been wrong all day. Except when we were off the air before Philadelphia made the pick, and I must say this, and it really gets in my throat to say what I have to say. But he sat here, and they were in Bristol at the time, George, and told me that Philadelphia, if there's going to be a quarterback taken, they're going to take it right now. And he, on honest to God, he really picked the fact that he had the wrong quarterback. I'll give him. He had the wrong quarterback.
I mentioned Randall Cunningham.
Yeah, 4 down. He had the wrong quarterback, but he did have a quarterback, and I'll give him that. So now he's 3 for 29.
Nobody hears the good things.
All right, Darren Gilbert selected by New Orleans. Wayne Davis selected by San Diego. Sam Rosen is standing by. You can imagine things must be getting a little bit feisty up in the crowd ranks with the Jets up next. Sam?
Well, every now and then when I need a break, I come up to the parallel bars, see my buddies here, and check out what they think as far as the New York Jets are concerned. What are the Jets going to do on this second pick?
We want that Mike Gann that guy just talked about.
You like him?
Yeah, sure.
Paul Zimmerman says defensive end Mike Gann. What do you think?
That's what we like to see. They need defensive help this year.
Well, they went with the wide receiver in the first pick. Did you like that first-round choice?
Well, Walker and Lamb Jones, they haven't panned out as we hoped, so we could use a wide receiver.
Okay, let's check the other side of the bar and see what we think here. New York Jets fans, what do you think this second-round pick will bring?
Mike Gann all the way.
Well, it's everybody likes Paul Zimmerman's pick. We may we'll get it right now. So let's go up to the podium and get that pick from the New York Jets.
New York Jets have selected Lester Lyles.
I told you.
Defensive back, Virginia. Lester Lyles, defensive back, Virginia. Buffalo, on a choice from Green Bay, is now on the clock.
Well, what do you think, guys? It's not Mike Gann.
Let's go for Del Rio for number 3.
Well, what do you think?
Who is this guy? Who is this guy? That's what we want to know.
The Fens are not too sure about the Jets' second-round draft pick, and I'm sure that Paul Zimmerman might have a comment or two about it.
Well, I'm gonna get a little group together from the balcony there. We're gonna storm the podium. Had enough of this.
All right, Lester Lyles selected defensive back out of the University of Virginia by the New York Jets. Paul McGuire next up, the
That was
Buffalo
my
Bills.
pick.
That was
I told
pick.
Paul when they were talking to Sam, I said, yeah, they ought to go for a defensive back, and especially from the Virginia area, and Lester Lyles would be the actual guy that they would
He's
go
been a
to.
Lester Lyles fan for quite a while. I know.
Let's take a look at Lester Lyles, the defensive back out of the University of Virginia. When you look at his ability, you see very clearly coming up fast, puts the hit, and rides him out of bounds. A young man who, out of the University of Virginia, averaged just a shade under 9 tackles per game.
You know, last year, they had all their defensive backs hurt. Jerry Holmes, they couldn't sign. It would have cost them about another $10,000. They couldn't sign him. He went to the USFL, taking Jesse Johnson with him. So they lost all their backs, and they fired their defensive back coach. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Talk a little bit about Darren Gilbert, too, the tackle out of Cal State Fullerton. Here's a team, you talk about ideal for the pros. They play the wide-open game. He's big. He's 6'5", 277 pounds. The kind of guy who a professional team definitely knows is used to that kind of...
Raiders were very high on him. They could have taken him if he would have lasted. They really liked him as well as anybody.
Paul Buffalo's coming up once again. Darren Gilbert, offensive tackle, 277 pounds worth of offensive lineman, first team all West Coast. Strong, is good in pass protection blocking. As you can see very clearly, that's the strongest point in our grading out of his abilities, Darren Gilbert.
Buffalo? Well, we're looking still, George, for a wide receiver. They got a defensive end, a defensive back, and a center. These were priorities for the Buffalo Bills, but now we're looking at wide receiver if there is one out there. And again, I'm asking you, is there one left?
Yeah, Burkett is a pretty good receiver. There are a few out there, but why not go quarterback now? How long do they want to wait for Kelly to come free from the USFL? How long do they want to, mark time? If there's any quarterback they like at all, they have this great wall of picks for the next 4 rounds. They can get the second best quarterback in the draft, not counting Kozar. It might be worth a shot.
We are waiting, of course,
Bono
on the USFL story to be told. So far, no